The story begins long before the Great Flood, long before Noah, long before the prophets we know today. It starts in a world still young, a world trying to understand what it meant to survive outside Eden. Adam and Eve had already walked away from the garden. The memory of the angels, the flaming sword, and the voice of God still echoed in their hearts. Their sons grew in that shadow, Cain and Abel. One would choose pride. One would choose obedience. And from that moment, history split into two paths. This script is about the path that came from Cain, the path that produced Enoch, a name wrapped in mystery, confusion, and forgotten pages. A man whose story was later erased, whose book was silenced, and whose identity has been mixed with another Enoch, the one taken to heaven. But today, we rewind everything. We look at the Enoch from the line of Cain, and we ask, why did his story disappear? Why did the early church reject the writings connected to him? And what does his life teach us today? Take a breath, because this is not a simple Bible story. This is a journey into history, fear, survival, and a world struggling between light and darkness. The world after Cain's exile. When Cain killed Abel, the world didn't just lose a brother. It lost innocence. Cain wandered eastward, marked by God, not cursed to die, but protected from death. Imagine that weight. Living with guilt, living with fear, living with the memory of doing something no human had ever done before. He reached a land called Nod, a place the Bible describes simply as wandering. A land with no roots, no city, no walls, just dirt, silence, and the heavy breathing of a man running from himself. Here, Cain tried to rebuild a life. He married. He worked the soil again. And then his son was born. His name was Enoch. Not Enoch the righteous. Not Enoch who walked with God. But Enoch from the line of Cain, whose life would shape the first city ever built by human hands. The Bible tells us that Cain named the city after his son. The first city in human history, born from pain. Think about that. Humanity's first attempt to gather, to build, to protect itself. It wasn't inspired by joy. It was inspired by fear. And Enoch grew up watching his father struggle with the weight of his choices. This is where his story begins. Enoch, raised in the shadow of a marked father. Imagine being the child of the most feared man on earth. Every story whispered in the night ended with your father's name. Every warning included his footsteps. People didn't want to come near him. They didn't want to come near you. Enoch learned early that the world was not safe. He saw how his father avoided the places where Adam and Eve lived. He watched him build walls around the new city, not to keep others out, but to keep the past away. Enoch carried that same restlessness. He was curious, hungry for meaning, but also angry. He knew the world saw him as the grandson of disobedience, and so he began searching. He looked for knowledge, wisdom, and forbidden things. Where others followed God's ways, Enoch tried to understand the world outside Eden in his own way. The stars, the winds, the spirits, the voices in the night. And slowly, he became known as a man of hidden knowledge. This is where the mystery around his writings begins. The lost book connected to Enoch. Centuries later, when scholars looked back at ancient traditions, they found references to books, strange books, books filled with visions, angels, and secrets of the heavens. Some of these writings were linked not to the righteous Enoch, but to the Enoch of Cain, the one whose curiosity led him to explore spiritual things outside God's instructions. Early church fathers rejected these texts completely. They called them dangerous. They said the teachings came from a corrupted lineage, a distorted spiritual search that mixed truth with rebellion. Some even believed these writings were used by groups who practiced rituals forbidden in Scripture. They warned believers to avoid them. And slowly, these manuscripts disappeared, buried, burned, erased. But legends survived. Stories claimed Enoch had visions of angelic beings, dark spirits, heavenly secrets, cosmic cycles, the hidden knowledge of Earth before the flood. Some said he learned things humans were never meant to know, and this made the early church uncomfortable. So his writings were labeled heretical, forbidden, banished from Scripture. This is why you rarely hear his name today. And when you do, it's mixed with the other Enoch, the good one, the righteous one. But they were not the same. Growing up in a city built on fear. As Enoch grew older, the city named after him grew wider. Streets appeared. Markets began. People traded goods. Children ran between homes built out of simple stone. But the one thing that never left the city was tension. People lived with the memory of what Cain had done. They lived knowing Cain's family was marked. And Enoch tried to break that cycle. He wanted the city to have meaning. So he wrote. He observed. He tried to record what life was like. Some say he wrote about the nature of life, the struggles of men, the fear of judgment, the early beginnings of civilization, the spiritual curiosity of a generation trying to understand the unseen world. This is where the confusion around the Book of Enoch begins. Because not all writings carrying his name came from the righteous Enoch. Some may have been inspired by the son of Cain, a man exploring knowledge without the guidance Adam once had. And the early church didn't want believers to confuse the two. So anything linked to Enoch from Cain's line was rejected. The city of Enoch, a civilization trying to understand God. One fascinating detail is this. The city of Enoch was the first place where humans began forming culture. They learned metalwork, music, art, craftsmanship, agriculture, hunting, trade. This was the beginning of the world we live in. But because it came from Cain's line, many assumed it was evil. But the truth may be more human than that. These were people trying to survive, trying to figure out how to live outside Eden without the presence of God walking among them. Enoch became a leader, a teacher, a recorder of history. His writings captured the loneliness of a generation cut off from the garden. He asked questions like, what does it mean to worship God when you cannot hear his voice? Do the angels still watch us? How do we return to the life we once had? These questions shaped the earliest spiritual thinking outside Adam's direct teaching. But they also opened the door to dangerous interpretations, which is why the church later rejected them. The growing city, a place of firsts. Enoch City was small at first, just a handful of homes, a rough marketplace, and a few families connected through Cain's lineage. But as generations grew, so did their hunger for survival. They needed tools. They needed music. They needed ways to work the ground faster. And above all, they needed meaning. This was not a city built on faith. It was a city built on human effort. And that effort produced the first breakthroughs in history. People began shaping metal. They learned how to sharpen blades from stone. They learned how to make instruments, flutes, harps, rhythms echoing through the night. They found new ways to farm, to hunt, to travel. Every step felt like discovery. Enoch wrote about this growing thirst. He wanted to document how humans adapted. He described how people looked up at the sky and wondered what lay beyond the stars. He wrote about the strange lights at night, lights his father Cain feared, but he felt drawn toward. These writings made him a recorder of knowledge, but also a seeker of things humanity wasn't ready for. The spiritual blindness of early civilization. Adam and Eve had experienced God directly. They had heard his voice. They knew him in a way no one in Enoch's city ever would. By the time Enoch grew older, generations were already drifting. People didn't pray the way Adam taught. They didn't ask for guidance. They asked for survival. And into that spiritual emptiness came curiosity. Enoch wrote, when man loses the memory of Eden, he begins to search for something to fill the silence. People began creating small rituals, not evil, just lost. Offerings to the sky, whispers to the wind, asking for rain, harvest, and protection. Enoch documented these practices. Some scholars believe this is why the church rejected his writings, because they reflected a world trying to create meaning without God's voice. It was not rebellion. It was confusion. But confusion shapes belief just as strongly as truth. Cain's legacy, a father's fear, a son's curiosity. Cain watched his son grow with a mixture of pride and worry. He saw Enoch questioning things he had learned through pain. Cain lived with the mark of God, the protection that came from judgment. It made him cautious. It made him strict. But Enoch didn't carry that same weight. He wanted to understand why God felt distant. He wanted to know if angels still walked the earth. He wanted to know what lived in the world beyond their small city. And sometimes, late at night, Enoch would slip out of the city walls and walk to the hills. He'd stare at the sky until morning. This habit scared Cain. It reminded him of the night he offered a sacrifice God rejected. It reminded him of the moment everything went wrong. But Enoch wasn't trying to recreate that moment. He was trying to find what Adam lost. And that dangerous curiosity is where the banned writings take root. The manuscripts now lost, the teachings of early seekers. Ancient traditions, not in the Bible, but in early Jewish and Middle Eastern texts, mention writings attributed to Enoch of Cain's line. Some fragments claimed Enoch described strange beings that roamed the hills, voices heard during storms, shadows that moved in the desert, stars that walked across the sky. The fear that humanity was not alone. These writings are not scripture. They weren't inspired by God. They were observations of a civilization walking blindly through spiritual darkness. The early church feared these writings for three main reasons. They blurred the line between real revelation and human imagination. They fueled early mystical groups who mixed God's truth with superstition. They conflicted sharply with the teachings of the prophets. So the safest decision, as early Christian leaders saw it, was to erase them. Today, all we have left are whispers, stories, ideas passed down through ancient cultures. But none of the full manuscripts survived the flood. Life in Enoch City, a world moving away from Eden.
Enoch watched the city change.
What began as a place of survival grew into a place of ambition. Families expanded, crafts improved, trade routes formed. People started to discover pleasure in music, in dance, in celebration. But with pleasure came pride, and with pride came forgetfulness. The stories Adam once told about the garden, the walk with God, the sound of his footsteps at dusk, they became legends. People heard them the way we hear fairy tales. Enoch felt torn between two worlds. One part of him respected Adam's traditions. Another part felt drawn toward something new, something unexplored. He wrote about this internal struggle, describing it as the split inside human nature. Years later, theologians said this is where the earliest ideas of dualism appeared. The belief that human beings carry light and darkness inside them. This thought scared the early church because it sounded too philosophical, too close to mystical beliefs. And so authors who quoted Enoch's ideas were labeled heretical. Their works were destroyed. The rise of Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. Enoch's life stretched far. He lived long enough to watch the city shift again through the arrival of three remarkable descendants. Jabal, the father of tent dwellers and herdsmen. He taught people how to live in organized groups, how to raise animals, how to travel for survival. Jubal, the father of musicians. His melodies echoed across the city. People gathered around him at night, discovering joy in rhythm. Tubal-Cain, the first metal worker. He shaped bronze and iron. He created tools that changed hunting, building, and agriculture forever. Enoch wrote about all three. Some of his lost writings described their innovations with awe and detail. Imagine reading the diary of the first human who saw metal spark against stone. Now imagine early Christian leaders reading that same content thousands of years later and finding references to practices, tools, or rituals they considered pagan or spiritually dangerous. This is one more reason Enoch's writings were never preserved. They belong to a world before God's full revelation. A world in spiritual confusion. A world judged by the flood. Why God allowed this world to grow, then chose to destroy it. Enoch lived during a time when humanity was multiplying rapidly. More cities formed, more families, more ideas, more pride. And slowly, the line of Cain expanded into a world where violence became common. People fought over land. They fought for power. They built bigger settlements. They began worshiping forces of nature, sun, moon, storms. Enoch saw this shift. He wrote about his fear that humanity was drifting too far from God. But his warnings were ignored. The righteous line from Seth still followed God. But Cain's descendants turned the world into a place of chaos. This growing darkness set the stage for the flood. When the wickedness of man spread across the earth, God made a decision to reset the world. And with the flood, everything connected to Enoch's city, every invention, every story, every manuscript, vanished under rising waters. The only memories survived through oral tradition, distorted, incomplete, fragmented. This is why today, Enoch of Cain's line feels like a ghost of history, present, but unreachable. The final days of Enoch, a quiet ending to a loud life. Enoch did not die violently. He did not receive a divine encounter. He did not walk into heaven. He died quietly in the city built in his name. A man who spent his life searching for meaning, observing humanity, and recording a world still learning to breathe.
He was not evil.
But he lived in the shadow of a father who made the first tragic choice in human history. His curiosity made him one of the earliest thinkers. His writings made him one of the earliest historians. His influence shaped the world before the flood. But because his knowledge grew from human struggle instead of divine revelation, the church later saw it as unsafe. And so he became forgotten, not cursed, just buried under time. The night the stars moved. Enoch had a habit that worried everyone, slipping out of the city at night to watch the sky. He loved the stillness, the wind, the way the world felt wide and endless under the stars. One night he claimed he saw something strange, a cluster of stars moving in a slow, deliberate path. He wrote about it. He described it as lights walking across the heavens. Modern people might call it imagination. But in a world that had no written science, no astronomy, no concept of space, this kind of observation became spiritual interpretation. Stories began to spread through the city. The heavens are speaking. Beings of light are watching us. The skies hold secrets. Enoch didn't invent these interpretations. He simply wrote what he saw. But people around him exaggerated it, blended it with fear, and turned it into the earliest form of cosmic mythology. This is where the church later drew a line. If a writing leads people into imagination over truth, it becomes dangerous. This is why anything connected to Enoch of Cain's line was rejected, not because he was evil, but because his world was spiritually confused. The voices near the hills. The land around the city was wild, full of caves, deep valleys, and strange winds that whistled at night. People often heard echoes they couldn't explain. Some said it sounded like human voices. Others claimed they heard whispers. Enoch, being curious, decided to investigate.
He wrote,
"I heard wind like speech, and I felt I was not alone." This simple sentence created centuries of misunderstanding. Some ancient groups later interpreted this as communication with spirits. Others used it to justify rituals that mixed superstition with worship. Some groups believed Enoch had special knowledge of beings beyond the physical world. But none of this was in the original writings. It was human imagination attached to fragments. Still, as these ideas grew, early church leaders saw a risk. If believers mix God's truth with mystical superstition, they lose their foundation. So anything tied to Enoch, even innocent observations, became forbidden. The rise of early rituals. Remember, this was a time before the law, before prophets, before temples, before sacrifices guided by God. People were trying to understand life on their own. They noticed. The ground responded to rain. Crops grew better under certain moons. Night felt spiritually different from day. Storms came with thunder that felt like warning. And slowly, rituals began forming. Not to worship idols, but to make sense of the world. Enoch documented these practices. Not to promote them, but to record how people lived. He wrote about stones placed at hilltops, fires lit for blessings, bread offered to the wind, water poured on soil for harvest luck. These were not demonic acts. They were acts of a lost world searching for meaning. But thousands of years later, when early Christian scholars read about these rituals, They worried believers would mistake them for spiritual guidance. So they banned the texts. The Watchers' misinterpretation. One of the biggest controversies comes from a later misunderstanding of Enoch's writings. Long after the flood, long after Enoch's manuscripts were lost, some ancient storytellers combined fragments from different traditions. They created stories about watchers, heavenly beings watching humanity. These stories were not from the righteous Enoch in Genesis. They were not from prophets. They were not divine revelation. They were fictional expansions attached later to the name Enoch. Because of this confusion, the entire collection of books labeled Enoch became suspicious. The church feared. What if people cannot separate truth from myth? What if they think Enoch's fictional stories are equal to Scripture? To protect believers, they removed the books. But the real Enoch of Cain's line never claimed visions of heavenly beings. He simply wrote what he saw. Strange stars, mysterious winds, rituals forming in early civilization. People after him twisted it. And that twist became the reason for the ban. The birth of early science and early spiritual confusion. Enoch City was the first to experiment with measurement, weather patterns, metalwork,
Sound.
agriculture techniques. But without God's guidance, science turned into superstition.
People believed.
If we follow this pattern, rain will come. If we burn this wood, the wind will change. If we place these stones, the spirits will protect our children. They were trying to understand creation without the Creator. This search wasn't evil. It was simply human, but it created a world full of spiritual noise. A noise Enoch wrote about in detail. And because of this, early Christians felt his writings carried too much confusion for new believers to handle. Why the early church was uncomfortable with Enoch's teachings. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. The church banned Enoch-related writings because 1. They came from a pre-flood world drowning in superstition. People mixed natural events with spiritual meaning. 2. Enoch's curiosity was interpreted as mystical knowledge. He never claimed visions, but later groups did. 3. His observations inspired beliefs that clashed with Scripture. 4. His identity was confused with the righteous Enoch. This created theological chaos. 5. Some manuscripts were used by groups whose teachings the church considered harmful. The church wasn't hiding truth. It was preserving clarity. But in doing so, Enoch, the son of Cain, disappeared from history. Enoch's personal struggle, the weight of being Cain's son. Behind all the mystery, all the legends, all the banned writings, there was a human being, a man trying to make sense of the world. Some nights, Enoch wrote about feeling torn. I am the son of a man marked by God. What does this say about me? He carried a weight he didn't choose. He inherited a story that wasn't his fault. But instead of turning away, he decided to understand the world. He became a thinker, a chronicler, a keeper of early human memory. His struggle was not between good and evil. It was between despair and curiosity, between fear and meaning, between silence and the desire to know. How Enoch's influence spread after his death. Even though the flood erased his city, stories about Enoch survived through oral tradition.
Some people spoke of him as
A historian, a wise observer, a thinker, a man who understood the earth's rhythms, a recorder of human struggles. But over centuries, as stories traveled from tribe to tribe, details twisted. His curiosity turned into visions. His observations turned into prophecies. His writings turned into forbidden knowledge. By the time early church leaders examined the stories, they were unrecognizable. So the safest path was to reject everything. But behind all the myths was a quiet man who simply wanted to make sense of a world falling apart. The coming darkness, setting the stage for the flood. As Enoch aged, the world became more violent. Cities fought. People wanted power. Greed became the heartbeat of civilization. Even the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, were tempted by the culture growing from Cain's lineage. Humanity drifted so far from God that even the air felt heavy. Enoch wrote about this heaviness. The earth feels burdened by us. We walk without purpose. We rise without light. These are the final echoes of his voice before history swallowed his world. The flood was coming, a storm not of rain, but of judgment. Soon everything Enoch recorded would disappear beneath rising waters. And this became the greatest reason his writings never survived. God allowed the flood to erase the confusion of a world that wandered without him.